graduate student in English literature at Wright State University. So she's used the Flu Network to arrive from Dayton, Ohio. Next, we'll have Mary Catherine Russell. She's from UNC Charlotte. She's a second-year graduate student concentrating in children's literature, and she's also an officer in our Children's Light Graduate Organization. And third, we'll hear from Alex Muller. He's from Winthrop University. He's a sophomore there. He's a creative writing major and a music minor. And he wrote this paper for a class entitled Literary Merits of Harry Potter, which we're all here to celebrate. All right.
My paper is titled There Is No Good and Evil, Only Power, and Those Too Weak to Seek It. It's an analysis of the cross-generational characteristics of Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series was highly praised in 1955. W.A. Auden considered it a masterpiece of its genre, and Bernard Levin wrote in Truth that it was one of the most remarkable works of literature in our or any time. It was incredibly popular, selling approximately 3 million copies around the world by 1968. The work was translated into all of the major European languages and many others, and transformed Tolkien into a cult hero. In these footsteps, J.K. Rowling presented the 7-book epic of Harry Potter. The success of Lord of the Rings is minuscule compared to the worldwide phenomenon of Harry Potter. In a New York Times article published in 2007, Rich states that in the 10 years since the first one, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the series has sold 325 million copies worldwide. So Harry Potter appeals not only to the children of today, but to the adult readers from Tolkien's generation. In this paper, I will argue that by examining the villains, Sauron from Lord of the Rings and Voldemort from Harry Potter, it's clear that Rowling used material from her predecessor, Tolkien, to create her masterpiece, yet added modern elements in order to give her series a cross-generational appeal. I will reveal these villains' similar character traits of branding possessions, the importance of and fear inspired by their name, their desire for immortality, and their fatal flaw. Whereas there are numerous parallels, key variations speak uniquely to the targeted audience. Tolkien wrote in a time when the Axis armies was a growing threat, and this fear is visible through the attack methods of Sauron's army. Rowling, by contrast, wrote in a time when the public was more afraid of train bombings than conventional battle, and terror was the key weapon of force. By borrowing traits from Sauron, yet adding modern elements of terror, Rowling created a villain that frightens adults of all ages as well as the children of today. So to start off, branding possessions. Sauron marked the orcs in his army with his symbol, the red eye. The orcs in the service of Barad-dûr used the sign of the red eye. Voldemort also marked his followers, the Death Eaters. Harry describes the mark as something like a vivid red tattoo, a skull with a snake protruding from its mouth. And Professor Snape reveals that every Death Eater had the same sign burned into him by the Dark Lord, so they could distinguish one another. In addition to branding possessions, both villains altered their names. In Lord of the Rings, Sauron did not use his right name, nor permit it to be spelt or spoken, whereas Voldemort was originally Tom Marvolo Riddle, but he violently opposed keeping his filthy Muggle father's name. Next, after they changed their names, fear of the name changes it further. In a conversation between Pippin and Beregond in Minas Tirith about the Black Riders, Pippin says, "I know of them, but I will not speak of them now, so near, and he's unable to finish the sentence. Beregond replies quietly, "So near to Mordor? Yes, there it lies, we seldom name it." Similarly, Boromir says in the Council of Elrond, "I have heard of the great ring of him that we do not name," which should sound familiar, because Voldemort, of course, is known by you-know-who, or he who must not be named. In a conversation with Hagrid, Hagrid tells Harry, "Well, I don't like saying the name if I can help it. No one does." "Why not?" Harry asks. "Gulp and gargoyles, Harry. People are still scared." And Ron explains that Voldemort, because people were so afraid to use his name, turned that to his advantage and put a taboo on his name so that he could track people. Ron tells Harry, "The name's been jinxed. That's how they track people. Using his name breaks protective enchantments. It causes some kind of magical disturbance. Anyone who says it is trackable." So the trace ensured that even those who, like Harry, were bold enough to use Voldemort's true name now had to return to you-know-who in order to evade capture. So as well as instilling fear with their name, both villains desired immortality. Sauron made a gold ring of power to rule all the rings of power that were given to men, dwarves, and elves. He made it in secret and poured his soul into it. But secretly, Sauron made the one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring. So as long as the ring survived, Sauron survived. Similarly to Horcruxes, which we all know about, so I'm going to skip that. So as long as the Horcruxes survived, Voldemort would. And both of their attempts were partially successful. Sauron was, when he lost the ring, for that time vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. In Harry Potter, Voldemort explains that when the curse backfired, when he was trying to kill Harry, "I was ripped from my body. I was less than spirit, less than the meanest ghost, but still I was alive. What I was, even I do not know. I was as powerless as the weakest creature alive and without the means to help myself, for I had no body. I settled in a faraway place in a forest, and I waited." So even though it was incredibly difficult to destroy Sauron's one ring in the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, and to destroy all of 7 of Voldemort's Horcruxes, and then Voldemort himself, there was hope because both villains had the same fatal flaw. They were not able to comprehend love. In Lord of the Rings, Sauron is focused on Aragorn and the army that's approaching the Black Gates. He never suspected that the ring was en route to be destroyed, especially by 2 such unlikely heroes as hobbits. For Frodo, the halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took on himself the burden, and alone with his servant he passed through peril and darkness, and came at last in Sauron's, despite even to Mount Doom, and there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade, and its evil consumed. It was because of Sauron's blindness that 2 hobbits and their love of the Shire and for each other were able to perform what an army of elves and men could not. Sauron never suspected this power of love. Voldemort has the same fatal flaw. Dumbledore explains to Harry, "Your mother died to save you. If there is one thing Voldemort cannot understand, it is love. He didn't realize that love as powerful as your mother's, for you, leaves its own mark, not a scar, no visible sign. To have been loved so deeply, even though a person who loved us is gone, will give us some protection forever." So despite the abundant similarities between the villains in The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, there's one key difference. Their attack methods are very different. Sauron wanted to cover all of the lands in the second darkness. His co-conspirator Saruman explains, "The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand, the world of men which we must rule. But we must have power to order all things as we will." Voldemort, on the other hand, wanted to be the greatest sorcerer in the world, and their method of force was terror. And they just, half of the Muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. And whereas in Lord of the Rings they amassed a great army to attack at the Black Gates, in Harry Potter it was a military coup from the inside. So Sauron's tactics were more relevant for the time that Tolkien was writing, post-World War I and pre and during World War II. Rowling, on the other hand, wrote during the War on Terror, and her villain reflected the current fear of terrorism. Janet Croft argues that the dead faces floating just below the surface of the water, seen when Frodo and Sam traveled through the dead marshes, were a standard image in Great War memories and fiction. In addition, the fortification of Ramus Echor, the outer wall of Minas Tirith, is a reminder of the futility of the Maginot Line, in which France gave a false sense of security against German invasion. Whereas in Harry Potter, we can see that the attack methods are different and much more like terrorism. Stremmel argues that though the series explores many themes, the theme of terror as a result of large-scale national strikes and of the battle between good and evil are central to Rowling's work. Stremmel says also that Voldemort is the quintessential terrorist figure because he is, up to this point in the series, completely unambiguous. At every moment, he poses a threat to society, and his sinister actions consequently cause pain, terror, and confusion to both the magical and Muggle communities. Also within the text, there are several things that have direct correlation to the current events of today. The pamphlets from the Ministry of Magic bear a striking resemblance to the pamphlets that Homeland Security put out post 9/11. The Death Eaters spread fear in familiar ways. They destroy bridges, they murder innocents, they compel children to kill their elders. And it is this correlation between real events and the text that makes it compelling and strikes home for the readers of all ages. Also, what is interesting is how Voldemort as a villain is different in a couple different ways. Paulosaurus Faria argues that Voldemort represents a new villain archetype, one that follows the same journey as the hero, but one that does not lead to redemption. It's certainly true that readers know a lot more about Voldemort than we ever learned about Sauron, unless you read Silmarillion. Not only does the reader know Tom Riddle's past intimately, Harry knows his past as well as his current thoughts and emotions because they've been intimately connected since Harry was a child. The only thing that Frodo knew was that he had to destroy the ring. He didn't know anything about Sauron, where he came from, how he fell. He just knew that he had to be destroyed. Not only does Harry know a lot about Voldemort, they're strikingly similar. They're linked from the very beginning, and Voldemort himself says there's a strange likeness between us after all. Even you must have noticed, both half-bloods, orphans, raised by Muggles, probably the only two Parselmouths to come to Hogwarts since the great Slytherin himself. We even look something alike. Noel Smith notices these similarities and also writes about them, arguing that Harry and Voldemort represent polarized aspects of good and evil, that is, are split part objects of the same whole object. Typo also writes about the similarities, arguing that Harry's doppelganger, Tom Riddle, is quite an obvious manifestation of his darker side, the heir of Slytherin who possesses all those unwanted characteristics by which Harry fatalistically fears to have been tied down. So we know a lot more about the villain, and he's a lot more similar to Harry, which brings it a lot closer to home. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, you had the villains that were the Easterners. You didn't know anything about them. They were of a different country, of a different race, and they were all bad. Whereas by mingling and mixing the hero and villain archetypes, Rowling seems to respond with our time by providing readers everywhere with a hero and a villain who are above all human, and with the possibility to see them interconnected with their humanity. Since Voldemort is much more human, it connects more with the young readers and makes him more fearful in that way.
Is Hogwarts and Walpole is the castle of Otranto. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto was first published in 1764 and is considered to be the first modern Gothic novel. Walpole's descriptions of a haunted castle, secret passageways, and supernatural activities created a genre that was echoed by the Bronte sisters, Bram Stoker, and more recently J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter series. Hogwarts is home to ghosts, ghouls, and a plethora of moving staircases, secret tunnels, and hidden spaces, all crucial characteristics for Gothic novels. The Castle of Otranto begins as a king's only son is crushed by the helmet of a large statue of Alfonso the Good, an ancestor to the rightful rulers of Otranto. Manfred, the current king, took ownership of the castle through trickery and seeks to keep the land in his name by marrying off his only son Conrad to the beautiful Princess Isabella. On Conrad's wedding day, Alfonso's helmet appears in the courtyard and crushes Manfred's son. Manfred enters the courtyard, pushes his way through a crowd, and finds the helmet. He beheld his child dashed to pieces and almost buried under an enormous helmet, 100 times more large than any cask ever made for a human being, and shaded a proportionable quantity of black feathers. Manfred is upset by the incident because, while he has no real remorse for his child's death, he fears losing his throne. He takes off to find Isabella, his son's betrothed, to ask her to be his wife instead. Manfred sends his servants to search for the girl, but 2 of them return after finding the headless statue lurking in the castle of Otranto. They stammer an explanation to the frustrated Manfred. I ran back too and said, "Is it the ghost?" "The ghost? No, no," said Diego, and his hair stood on end. "It is a giant, I believe. He is all clad in armor, for I saw his foot and part of his leg, and they were as large as the helmet below in the court." As he said these words, my lord, we heard a violent motion and the rattling of armor, as if the giant was rising. The castle of Otranto is haunted by the large statue, as Alfonso seeks to protect his home. Similarly, in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the statues of Hogwarts come to life to defend their castle from Voldemort. And now, Pierre totum locomotor, cried Professor McGonagall, and all along this corridor the statues in suits of armor jumped down from their plinths, and from the echoing crashes from the floors above and below, Harry knew that their fellows throughout the castle had done the same. Hogwarts is threatened, shouted Professor McGonagall. Man the boundaries, protect us, do your duty to the school. Clattering and yelling, the horde of moving statues stampeded past Harry, some of them smaller, others larger than life. There were animals too, and the clanking suits of armor brandished swords and spiked balls on chains. This scene is reflected in the film Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 2, as statues fall from the sky and walk menacingly through the castle. Just as Alfonso's helmet drops and his body stalks through Otranto, the Hogwarts statues come to life. Manfred, tired of his barren wife and entranced by the young and beautiful Isabella, finds her in the bowels of the castle and propositions her to be his new wife. Isabella is more afraid of Manfred than the dark tunnels of the castle and flees through the secret passageways. When Manfred tries to find her, a nearby portrait comes to life. Manfred, distracted between the flight of Isabella, who had now reached the stairs, and his inability to keep his eyes from the picture, which began to move, had however advanced some steps after her, still looking backwards on the portrait, when he saw it quit its panel and descend on the floor with a grave and melancholy air. "Do I dream?" cried Manfred, returning, "or are the devils themselves in league against me? Speak, infernal spectre." The portrait ghost then goes on to lead Manfred astray, allowing Isabella to escape the crazed king through an underground tunnel. Otranto, like Hogwarts, has secret passageways and moving portraits. Just as Phineas and Angelus reluctantly relays messages for the Order, a portrait in Manfred's castle lets Isabella escape of life and misery with the king. Hogwarts is a prime example of a Gothic castle with its moving staircases, secret tunnels, and mysterious talking portraits. A necessary part of Gothic literature is the focus on space and places, with a particular emphasis on secret and mysterious locations within a castle. When Harry finds the Room of Requirement and uses it to subvert authority, he is using a secret space within a Gothic castle. The many spaces in Hogwarts are first introduced in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone as Harry reflects on the castle that is his new school. There were 142 staircases at Hogwarts, wide, sweeping ones, narrow, rickety ones, some that led somewhere different on a Friday, some with vanishing step halfway through that you had to remember to jump. Then there were doors that wouldn't open unless you asked politely or tickled them in exactly the right place, and doors that weren't really doors at all, but solid walls just pretending. It was also very hard to remember where anything was, because it all seemed to move around a lot. The people in the portraits kept going to visit each other, and Harry was sure the coats of armor could walk. Hogwarts, in effect, is the perfect Gothic castle. The seemingly familiar is made strange and exhilarating as staircases move and doors open into hidden spaces. Throughout the series, Harry finds new spaces within Hogwarts. He uses the Marauder's map. He uses the Marauder's map in Prisoner of Azkaban, which he used to enter and exit the castle through underground pathways, just as Isabelle uses an underground tunnel to escape the castle of Otranto. In Goblet of Fire, Harry discovers the Room of Requirement, which he uses to eventually evade Umbridge and subvert authority in the Order of the Phoenix. In Deathly Hallows, Harry uses underground tunnels to re-enter the castle from the Hogshead.
Hey, it's gonna be luck. For your surprise.
Not more rabbit before it's cooking, I hope. Be surprised if we can digest it. Fine.
Robert Harris notes the different characteristics of a Gothic novel as outlined by Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. He describes such characteristics as footsteps approaching, which Harry experiences as he explores Hogwarts under the guise of his invisibility, and clanking chains, which Harry hears from the Bloody Baron, who wears the chains as a symbol of his murder of Helena Ravenclaw. Peeves is notorious for his crazed laughter, and the shrieking shack serves as a source for distant howling and mysterious and frightening sounds. Harry often feels trapped in detention with both Snape and Umbridge, and Harry flies through a storm during the Quidditch match in Prisoner of Azkaban. Rowling's use of Gothic themes throughout the Harry Potter series set a mood first imagined by Walpole in the 18th century. Walpole's Castle of Otranto created the first haunted castle which laid the foundations for Rowling's Hogwarts. In effect, Rowling placed archetypes first made famous in 1764, placing her novel within the genre of Gothic literature. Rowling's interplay of a spooky, mysterious castle entrances readers and ultimately contributes to the widespread success of the Harry Potter series.
As a boy, I considered myself to be a Harry Potter aficionado. What were my credentials? Well, I had read each of the books exactly one time, immediately as they came out. I attended midnight releases, movie premieres, and I owned a Quidditch bedspread. People used to tell me that I looked like Harry Potter, and I even once started to write a Harry Potter book myself when I decided that J.K. Rowling was taking much too long in completing the Goblet of Fire. Like any faithful fan, I finished that final book hungrily after having retired that bedspread several years prior, and when I closed its cover, I found myself crestfallen. A part of my childhood was dead. I left my scholarship of sorcery on my bookshelf. Once I had finished the series, I hardly thought of the books until one of the movies would come out, and then I would only lament on how the film industry was showing my dead childhood no respect by cutting away so many of the subplots and minor characters. While I was thus preoccupied, a classmate of mine usurped my crown of credentials for Potterian authority as I was about to graduate high school. She was a mixture of Hermione Granger and Luna Lovegood, and she had read each book in the series 21 times, trumping my former record by a whopping 20. I tried to shrug this off by occasionally joining in the jokes of her inappropriate Harry Potter fetish, But truly, I admired her for something that I could not articulate at the time, fresh as I was in my grief of the saga ending. Her understanding of the Harry Potter series was reminiscent of Luna Lovegood's explanation of the Phoenix in the 7th book. Well then, I think the answer is that a circle has no beginning. A circle also then has no end. The symbol of the Phoenix becomes a metaphor for the Harry Potter novels, and thus the books allow themselves to be reread in a cycle. Upon my second reading of the text while studying as a freshman in college, I realized that J.K. Rowling has not merely penned a trivial page-turner for popular culture, she has made a profound statement about the human struggle to accept death, much like any fan's struggle to accept the end of a beloved book. Through the villain Voldemort, the hero Harry, and the myriad minor characters, Rowling creates a parable on dealing with death, surrounded by a context which she uses to teach her readers, even after that final page is turned and the magical world vanishes. Voldemort and the significance of a modern context. Voldemort develops the context in which the reader may relate the fantasy of the novels to real life. In an essay explaining the technology of magic, Elizabeth Tier commented on how fantasy writers often juxtapose good and evil by contrasting the good of pastoral, pre-capitalist serenity with the evil of modern industrial hell, citing Tolkien's Hobbits and Sauron along with Philip Pullman's inventive technologies and the non-industrial writing of Ursula Le Guin. J.K. Rowling is no exception, and Voldemort's refusal to accept death mimics the inventive technologies of our modern culture. Rowling's older readers can appreciate this context in which Voldemort's pursuit of everlasting life becomes a metaphor for the biotechnology revolution, which the social philosopher Francis Fukuyama argues will move Western society into a post-human future. The Horcruxes Voldemort uses to cling to life become the pills of new neuropharmacology, and his testing of the boundaries of magic become testing of the possibilities of science done in the lab. Indeed, Voldemort confirms Fukuyama's fear by moving into a post-human existence. He becomes snake-like with gleaming red eyes. In the Goblet of Fire, Voldemort's resurrection is nearly allegorical for embryonic stem cell technology, with the bone of the father unknowingly given and the blood of the enemy forcibly taken. Voldemort's evil serves as a cautionary tale to society by reiterating Fukuyama's warning against the rise of science. Voldemort's quest for pure blood dominance over the rest of the wizarding world is comparable to the Nazi practice of eugenics, which Fukuyama cites as the precursor to our modern genetic engineering. Rowling uses Tom Riddle's quest for the darkest of magic to show that just because something may be possible, creating not only one Horcrux but 7, it is not always ethical or advisable. In the end, this quest for ultimate immortality proves to be Voldemort's downfall. By making his soul so unstable, his apparent mastery of making Horcruxes falls out of his control when he creates one unknowingly in Harry. And this suggests that technology may ultimately be out of human control, never meant for humans to master at all. By creating this modern context, Rowling has created a villain for her parable who can be abhorred by any reader for any number of reasons, only beginning with these technological ones that I've begun to list. However, the best thing about any parable is that it is not specific but generic. As Hermione comments on the tale of the three brothers, it's just a morality tale. By being the villain of the story, the character of Voldemort serves as a negative example for the reader, just as the first two brothers in the fairy tale of the Deathly Hallows serve as a negative example to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. While Voldemort's hunger for Horcruxes can easily illustrate modern society's lust for longer lifespans, it is more important that it is his evil which must be overcome. By setting Voldemort as the inherent problem that must be faced, Rowling creates the context in which her hero must triumph. Thus, the basic premise is realized simply: if running from death is wrong, then Harry Potter must exemplify the right way to face it. The problem then is not dying, but how to accept it. Now we move to Harry Potter and the significance of the Seeker. Harry Potter's heroism has been called into question by Muggle critics and the wizarding world alike. A.S. Byatt comments on the Harry Potter series: it is the substitution of celebrity for heroism that has fed this phenomenon. While Harry doubts his ability as well, as he tells Dumbledore in Half-Blood Prince, but I haven't got any uncommon skill or power. However, no one, not even Death Eaters, can deny that Harry is a damn good flyer, as the fake Mad-Eye Moody points out. It is the only profound skill that he seems to inherit from his father as he becomes the youngest Seeker on the Gryffindor team in a century. Throughout the series, Harry must rely on the help of his friends to solve many of the greater mysteries of Hogwarts, yet all the while his skill as the Seeker is sharpened and its significance is realized. In the context of Rowling's death parable, Harry shows a simple strength that everyone possesses, yet the extraordinary courage to exercise it, the strength to die. Oliver Wood's advice from the first Quidditch practice in the first book becomes the refrain for the rest of the series. He says, "Keep out of the way until you catch sight of the snitch. We don't want you attacked before you have to be." This resonates first and foremost with the structure of each of Rowling's books. The plot coincides conveniently with the duration of the school year, with the climax and resolution often coming in the end as the children are getting ready to return home. Harry later uses the same tactic subconsciously as he decides to hunt for Horcruxes over Hallows in the 7th book. Earlier in that same book, Harry realizes that Regulus Black turned against Voldemort and sought to destroy the only Horcrux he knew to exist. As Harry notices an old Quidditch photograph in a bedroom in Grimmauld Place, he comments, "He played Seeker." The role of the Seeker then becomes synonymous with the role of the hero as Harry continues Regulus's mission to defeat Voldemort by seeking to destroy the secret Horcruxes. Harry even manages to catch the lost diadem of Ravenclaw in a description reminiscent of his former Quidditch games. The diadem seemed to fall in slow motion, turning and glittering as it dropped. In his final duel with Voldemort, Harry manages to disarm him and catch the Elder Wand with the unerring skill of the Seeker. In the wider context of the death parable, Oliver Wood's advice still applies. In the tale of the three brothers, Death searches for the third brother for many years, but because of the invisibility cloak, he is never able to find him until he reaches an old age and is ready to depart from life. The third brother becomes a symbol for the Seeker, keeping out of the way until he is ready to die. In this way, Harry fulfills the role of the Seeker not only as he searches for Horcruxes, but as he travels from hiding spot to hiding spot until he is ready to face Voldemort. When he realizes that dying is the only way to defeat him, he sheds his invisibility cloak twice, first to meet his death in the Forbidden Forest, and then to duel Voldemort in the Great Hall for the final time. The tale of the three brothers lends itself to the larger parable that Rowling has created over the span of her 7 novels. The role of the Seeker and the character of the third brother add to the context of Rowling's death parable by creating the theme of choice. Nicholas Flamel becomes the Seeker when he chooses to destroy the Sorcerer's Stone, ending his life. Regulus Black becomes the Seeker when he chooses to turn against Voldemort and attempt to destroy his Horcrux, choosing to die as well, as he writes in the fake locket, "I know I will be dead long before you read this." Dumbledore becomes Seeker as well, destroying one of the Horcruxes and choosing the manner of his death by telling Snape, "You must kill me." Harry's acceptance of death coincides with the acceptance of his hero's fate, yet through his fate, Harry becomes the symbol for the everyman, because indeed, every man must die. Dumbledore invites his students to remember Cedric Diggory in the Goblet of Fire. If the time should come when you have to make a choice between what is right and what is easy, remember what happened to a boy who was good and kind and brave. A boy who was brave enough to accept death with as much grace as anyone could. In this way, Cedric Diggory was also a Seeker. And this brings us to the larger context of the children's tale. In the end, the greatest lesson of J.K. Rowling's parable is not learned through the extreme evil of the villain or the sacrifice of the hero. It is told through the rest of her characters. These many minor characters, like Cedric Diggory, fill in the remaining spaces of the created context, adding what Dumbledore would call the most important component, love. Indeed, without love, death would not hold the same significance. Mrs. Weasley fears the death of her family above all else because she loves them so dearly, as we see in the 5th book with the scene with Boggart. The deaths of Sirius and Dumbledore affect Harry because he loved them for their paternal guidance and misses them when they leave him so unexpectedly. Of course, the reason that Voldemort avoids death is a different reason entirely. For him and several other characters in the books, death is not a loss of love, but the loss of power. Ironically, Voldemort holds both love and death to mean the same thing, a sign of weakness. Through his creation of the negative example in Rowling's death parable, the reader realizes that Voldemort is a coward to run from these most natural of human experiences. Francis Fukuyama suggests that this is the most alarming aspect of the post-human future, when humans lose that which comes intrinsically to them, born out of societal fear. Through this modern context, Voldemort's fear to love and to die become real, and Rowling implores her readers to be brave. Do not be afraid to love, and do not be afraid to die. She quotes Aeschylus in the beginning of Deathly Hallows, "Bless the children, give them triumph now." And the children are at the center of Harry Potter. The books have been called children's books ever since the New York Times created a separate bestseller list for them to occupy, yet it is no secret that adults have enjoyed the series ever since their children have. This is significant because while Voldemort's fear of death echoes the real-life societal fear that clings to science, the real-life child-adult appreciation of the books echoes the role that children and adults share equally in the novels. In the fifth book, the readers come face to face with the first anti-Voldemort movement, the Order of the Phoenix. This group of characters is familiar because of their surnames, Potter, Weasley, Longbottom, among others. Later in that same novel, the students of Hogwarts decide to make their own order, Dumbledore's Army, which is also familiar with some similar surnames, Potter, Weasley, Longbottom. Rowling uses three main generations of characters in her novel. The first generation contains many of the original members of the Order, including James and Lily, Sirius and Lupin. The second generation contains their children and provides the main context for the books, with Harry, Ron, Ginny, Hermione, etc. The final generation is only seen in the epilogue of the last book, but still remains important: Rose, Hugo, Teddy Lupin, Albus, James, and Lily. These generations are important because they allow the former generations a chance for redemption. Sirius and Regulus get to redeem their Slytherin family with their bravery. Harry redeems his father when he forgives Snape and names his son Albus Severus. All of the Weasley children redeem their lower-class family with exciting, extravagant careers, and Ron and Hermione allow their children to redeem their cat and mouse gender role clash by swapping the first letters of their names with one another and the names of their offspring, Rose and Hugo. Thus, in the Deathly Hallows, J.K. Rowling brings her death parable full circle. She kills off almost the entire remaining part of the first generation for their children to prevail, to give them triumph now. And so, I've only begun to list one context in which these books may be read, and I think this is why they can be reread, because they end with one generation of students awaiting the Hogwarts Express nervously. And that's so similar to the beginning of The Sorcerer's Stone, and so it only seems natural to go back and read them again, even if we don't know what happens to Rose, Hugo, and all the rest. But these rereadings of the books allow a greater understanding, and rereading allows new concepts and context to be seen. Perhaps the next time I choose to read these books, I will find a parable on something else, or at least many more aspects to this first one which I have begun to discuss. Indeed, I find myself wandering back up to Dumbledore's office to converse with the portraits of headmasters past, gaining new appreciation from their words. I find myself lingering over the pensieve, immersed in memories of which I am fond, and others which I have tried to avoid remembering at all. Yet rising from the bottom of its basin, I can see my childhood, and it is not dead after all.
Alex, would you see Snape as a seeker?
It's a good question. I think so, because he does choose to die, and I think he knows that he has to die. And there's this funny thing on the internet that says how Harry Potter should have ended. And Snape gets attacked by the snake, and then he comes back later and they're like, "Professor, you're still alive." And he's like, "I've been drinking anti-venom potion for years." is definitely important.
Renee, you mentioned that because Lord of the Rings is based on World War II and Harry Potter was based more on terror, but I've noticed that because World War II has happened in the past, and many things that we do are reflected in the past and neighbors. So I'm having here that Harry Potter is also representing World War II in many ways. So do you believe that that's true?
I do think that there are definitely portions of the text that recall back to World War II, and then especially when Dumbledore is explaining his past and that, because you're exactly correct. Even though it's a previous generation and it doesn't recall certain memories for me, it definitely is still there for the older generation because that was a large portion of their life, and it's still very present in who they are.
Alex, I thoroughly enjoyed your comparison to the snitch and the seeker, and I was kind of waiting for it because the snitch is the last thing Harry has before he accepts his final death.
Exactly. And that's a great point. And I did leave out parts semi-intentionally for other people to think further on it. And that's great. And like you said, with Snape as a seeker, there's tons of examples in this context which I've outlined here, and there's even more context with even more symbols that you can find as well, I'm sure. So that's a great point.
I had a question for MCAT. I really enjoyed looking at that list of Gothic castle characteristics and thinking about Hogwarts. And I really liked the things that you chose, specifically from the books and the movies that showed the comparison. But what would you say is the significance that in Hogwarts these elements which normally inspire dread in the main character or the reader of a Gothic novel are often used humorously in Rowling's work?
I thought about that actually just now when I was reading the 142 staircases. Some you have to tickle the right way, and I think that's part of Rowling's charm, like kind of how she makes it her own. Because when we first read Sorcerer's Stone, so much of it is in like the dull, humorous British literature tradition, and so it's what like entrances children to read it. And as they go on, they get a little bit darker as Harry grows up. But I think there's something in that where she mixes what we expect to be like vampires, werewolves, Gothic novel with humor because they're children. Like Harry's 11 when he goes there, and so I think there's kind of a mixing of it that makes it so appealing.
I was wondering if you'd ever considered, in terms of the cycles of Harry Potter, if its being a Bildungsroman has anything to do with that kind of continuing to renew itself and its audience.
Definitely, I do, and we talked about that in our class, and we had a whole section devoted to, coming of age with several characters, and it's obviously Harry, but also Neville. He comes of age starting in the 5th, and then going on to the 7th, he fulfills a very important role, and definitely, and I believe someone else is presenting a paper on the cycle of the books later. It's yes indeed. So definitely, so that might be in there.
Yeah.
Coming soon. PotterWatch conference near you.
Catherine, I was wondering, were you thinking at all about, like, I had never heard of Walpole's. Where did you just like research Gothic? I mean,
I'm in a British Gothic literature
classes. Did you see any? I was thinking of like Northanger Abbey.
Yes, we read. This was like before all of those, and then you can see where they draw from it. I've actually got a chart. It's like we have all of our characteristics of the Gothic. We've got Castle of Otranto, Sicilian Romance, Northanger Abbey, and like it's just funny how when he originally wrote Castle of Otranto, he published it as kind of like a joke, I guess, nowadays, because he has it listed as something he found in the wall somewhere that someone else had written, one of those kind of things. And then he republished it with the subtitle A Gothic Story, written by himself, and so he like basically created the Gothic itself by doing this. And then so many people said, wow, this is such a page turner, we love spooky stuff, and then it went everywhere.
So he was like the primary.
Yeah, he was the guy.
Well, and it reminds me of when, speaking of like the comedy part within, British humor, it's like with Northanger, it's like Northanger is fully making
such a
fun.
satire, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, but Jane Austen's doing it on the level of someone who's older.
Right.
And then it makes sense because if you're 11, then it needs to be tickling.
Yeah.
I too really liked the Gothic piece, and I really liked how you focused on the castle and Hogwarts. But talking about the way it's sort of given a humorous slant at times, it made me think that outside of Hogwarts, there's also very much in the surrounding landscape.
Yes,
particularly if you look at Radcliffe and the Brontes, the way, for example, the Forbidden Forest is portrayed, and it seems to me one of the most Gothic moments in the early novels is coming across what we realize will be kind of the Voldemort figure of feeding from the unicorn or the Forbidden Forest. The things that aren't seen, the shadows, the edge of the corner of the eye, and that stuff's taken really seriously in a Gothic context. I mean, that's the scary stuff in early films, or the things that are lurking in the pool, right?
What inspires terror and stuff,
Exactly. And so that seems to be a nice parallel to the things you're saying about Otranto, that the surrounding landscape also reflects those early Gothic texts in the way she uses the grounds around her.
Other comments, questions?
Alex, right? I was really interested in how you were describing Harry's story as a quest to become human, and then Voldemort is trying to avoid being human because he's avoiding death, running from it. He's afraid of it. I don't know. I mean, I know some of you in here have read the Hunger Games, and you teach the Hunger Games. I'm thinking about the people who live in the capital, how they try to take like all these non-human characteristics and implement themselves. Like there's a character who has tiger stripes. You have all these different like I can't think of a good word. I mean, non-human things, and these are supposed to be the norm. And then I read an article also where this is not too far off into the future. So I feel like you're really on the right track with that. That is really brilliant.
Thank you. It's just one of those things that I was studying the Francis Fukuyama book in another class that semester, and he compares it to A Brave New World, primarily, which I haven't read. But I get the gist of it. And it is in a lot of books. Like, I don't know if any of you have read Philip Pullman's, his Dark Materials. In that, there's a big thing where they're trying to separate the soul and all this other stuff. And so I think a lot of fantasy writers do that about separating the intrinsic human qualities, and then that creates a dystopian context and whatnot. But yeah, it is scary to think about, and it is definitely something to think about in the future.
Time for one more question or discussion prompt.
Renee, I really enjoyed how you talked about all the symbols that Rowling pulled from Tolkien and how they're kind of reconfigured to fit the context of contemporary issues. Have you seen those echoed back like further beyond Tolkien's series? Do you know if he pulled those from any other novels in mythology, or were they pretty well rooted in World War I, World War II, and actual historical symbols?
I'm going to restate the question, make sure I understand.
Yeah.
Like, did Tolkien pull from?
Yeah, I mean, have you seen that echoed in literature prior to Tolkien?
Well, I mean, every writer steals from the people that came before. And I mean, Tolkien studied mythology extensively, especially Norse mythology, and a lot of the Elder Edda and the Norse legends is what he pulled from to create a lot of his characters and the legends that surround them. So yes. So I think she pulled. I don't. Of course, who knows if she researched the Norse legends clear she pulled from Tolkien, but yes, Tolkien pulled from his own research and academic background.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have a lovely lunch break now in the next room.
Hopefully
We're all moving back and forth. So have at it, and we'll see you back in about an hour and 10